I have told this story exactly twice. Once at a memorial I was not invited to speak at and spoke it anyway, and once to my own daughter when she was old enough to ask why I keep a folded apron in a glass case on my office wall, behind my commendations, where the light hits it first thing in the morning. I am telling it a third time now because the men I teach have started to look at me the way I once looked at her, as if rank and certainty are the same thing, and they need to hear, from a man who was wrong in the worst possible way, how completely a person can be wrong and still be allowed to fix it. My name is Merrick Vane. In the years I am about to describe, I was a captain, the operations officer of a task force that does not exist on any organizational chart I am permitted to draw for you, working out of a firebase we called Ash Hollow because it sat in a black bowl of old volcanic rock high on the Sorrel Ridge, 1,100 feet above a valley that the maps insisted was empty, and that was not empty at all. I was 34. I was good at my job in the narrow way a man is good at a job he has never been seriously tested in. I could move a company across bad ground on paper. I could write an order that a tired sergeant could read in the dark and not misunderstand. I believed, the way you believe in gravity, that the war belonged to certain kinds of men, and that everyone else was scenery against which those men performed. The firebase was a hard place. We had patched concrete and 3 hardened shelters and a water situation that was always one broken pump away from a crisis. And we had the wind, which came off the ridge at night like something with an opinion. We had a galley that fed 240 souls out of a space built for half that, run by a small woman with gray coming into her hair at the temples and forearms like a stonemason's, who wore a stained apron over fatigues with no rank that I ever bothered to read, and who I knew in those days only as the person who made the coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. I did not know her name. I want you to sit with that. I was the operations officer of that firebase. I knew the blood type of every man on the assault element, and I did not know the name of the woman who fed all of us twice a day, because I had decided without ever deciding it that she was furniture. The trouble started on a Tuesday, which is when trouble always starts. A reconnaissance team, 11 men, the best we had, an element so good the rest of us told stories about them the way you tell stories about weather, went into the high country east of the ridge to put eyes on a supply route, and at 400 on Wednesday their last transmission came in broken and short and final. 3 words we could make out, then nothing. Then for 2 days, a silence that the whole firebase carried around like a held breath, because every one of us knew what silence meant up there. It meant they were dead, or it meant something worse than dead, which up there was being taken, because the people who held that country did not take prisoners to keep them. They took prisoners to use them on camera slowly as a message. We had seen the messages. Colonel Aldous Rain ran the task force. He was a competent man, and I will not paint him as a fool, because the lesson of this story is not that fools exist. It is that competent men make the same mistake fools make, only with better posture. He was 60, silver ramrod, a man who had earned every ribbon on his chest in places I had only read about, and he loved those 11 men the way a hard man loves, which is to say without ever once saying so. When the silence hit 48 hours, he stopped sleeping. He stood over the map table in the war room, a low shelter with plywood walls and a single screen and a string of bare bulbs, and he moved his hand over the ridge line as if he could press the men back into existence through the contour lines, and he could not, and it was killing him by inches. We could not go get them. I want to be honest about the box we were in, because the box is the reason for everything that followed. The high country between Ash Hollow and the place we believed they were being held was 40 miles of knife ridge and deadfall scree and old terraced ground that funneled every approach into 3 or 4 choke points, and every choke point was watched. An air insert would be heard from 20 miles out. The valley acted like a bell. A ground element of any size would be tracked from the first ridge and bracketed at the second, and we would lose the rescue force and still not have the team. I ran the numbers a dozen ways across that table, and every way ended the same. A column of our coffins going up the mountain to fetch a column of coffins coming down. Rain knew it. The staff knew it. We were 11 men into a grief we could not pay our way out of, and the war room had gone quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when smart people have run out of road. That was the night the woman from the galley walked in. She came in with a tray, which is why no one stopped her. She had come in with a tray 1,000 times, set the coffee at Rain's elbow, gone out again, invisible. But this night she set the tray down and she did not leave. She stood at the foot of the map table with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she looked at the contour lines the way I looked at them, which I noticed and did not understand that I noticed, and she said, in a voice that was quiet and level and carried anyway, "You're planning the wrong thing. A column can't do this. One person can." I remember the silence. I remember that I laughed, not cruelly, I told myself, just the short reflexive laugh of a man hearing a category error, and I remember that a major named Holt said, "Ma'am, this is a closed briefing," and I remember most of all the way Colonel Rain lifted his eyes from the map, slow, to see who had spoken, and the way his face changed when he saw the apron. He was tired. I have spent years trying to give him that. He was tired and frightened for his men in a way a commander is never allowed to show, and the fear came out as the thing fear always comes out as, which is contempt aimed at the nearest safe target. He looked at her apron and her gray temples and her flour-dusted hands, and he said the words that I have carried like a stone in my shoe for the rest of my life. He said, "Stay in the kitchen." He said it flatly, the way you'd correct a child who'd wandered into traffic. And then, because the room was tense and men under that kind of pressure will grab any release, a couple of the staff officers chuckled, and the chuckle gave Rain permission, and he waved his hand at her, an actual shooing motion, the gesture you make at a dog near the table, and he said it again, louder for the room. "Stay in the kitchen. Let the soldiers handle the war." I did not laugh that second time. But God help me, I did not stop it either. I was the operations officer. I was the man whose entire function was to know what was on that firebase, and a woman had just told me correctly that a column could not do this and one person could, and instead of asking the only intelligent question available, which was asterisk how would you know that, I stepped between her and the map table and I put my body in her path and I said, "You heard the colonel. We've got it from here." I steered her toward the door with a hand that did not quite touch her shoulder, the way you heard someone you've decided is in the way, and I said low, so the room wouldn't hear me be unkind, "The coffee's good. Stick to the coffee." She let me move her. That is the part I think about most. She let me steer her to the door of that shelter without a flicker, without a word, her face as level as the horizon, and at the threshold she stopped, and she looked back, not at me, through me. The way you look past a screen door at the colonel, at the map, at the contour lines, and she said one more thing, mild as milk. "They're holding them at the old terrace works under Saddle 3, northwest face in the cut. They'll move them in 4 days on camera. You have 3. And then she said, "When you run out of plans, I'll be in the kitchen," and she walked out into the wind, and the door banged, and Holt said the nerve of some people, and Rain said nothing and bent back to the map. And I went back to running numbers that I already knew would not work, and not one of us, not one, wrote down what she had said. I have read the after-action report of that night more times than I can count. It does not mention her. I wrote it. I left her out, the way you leave out the weather, and the omission is the truest confession I have ever made, because it shows you exactly the size of the blindness. A woman had walked into a war room, named the holding site, named the face of the mountain, named the timeline down to the day, and named the only method that could possibly work, and the official record of the United States military notes only that the operations officer reviewed 3 insertion plans and found them unviable. She was not in the kitchen. She had never been in the kitchen, but it would be 2 more days before any of us was willing to find out where she actually was, and a man named Pell would have to nearly die first. For 2 days we ground ourselves against the same wall. Rain aged a year a day. The plans got more desperate and less honest. At one point, we seriously discussed a daylight air assault that everyone in the room knew was a way of choosing how to lose rather than whether to. And I watched men I respected talk themselves toward it because the alternative was sitting still while the clock she had named ran down. 3 days, she'd said. By the second night, we were inside her window with nothing on the table but ways to die, and I started, in the private back room of my own head where I did not have to admit it to anyone, to hear her voice. A column can't do this. One person can. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself a galley steward could not possibly know the northwest face of Saddle 3. I told myself a great many things, and I went to find her anyway, because I had run out of better ideas, and a man who has run out of better ideas will finally, grudgingly, listen to the one he threw out. I found her in the galley at 200, which told me something before she said a word, because nobody is in a galley at 200 unless the day's work has not let go of them. She was sitting at the steel prep table with a topographic map spread flat, our map, the operational one, that should not have been in the galley and that I would later learn she had simply walked into the operations shelter and taken while we slept, the way a person takes a thing that is theirs, and she had it covered in pencil. Not arrows, not the fat, confident arrows we drew. Little marks, tick marks along the ridges, tiny notes in a cramped hand. Times. She had times written next to points on the trail, and as I came closer and my eyes adjusted, I saw that the times were a schedule, not of our movement but of theirs, of the watch. She had reconstructed from something, the rotation of the sentries on a mountain 40 miles away that none of us could approach, and she had found the seam in it, the 20-minute window twice a night when the high post and the saddle post changed over and the cut went briefly blind, and she had circled it in pencil so light you could barely see it, the way you mark a thing you have already memorized and are only writing down out of discipline. "You came," she said, not looking up. "Sit, you're the planner, you'll understand it faster than they will." I did not sit. I stood there with my arms crossed in the doorway, the operations officer, and I said the thing I had come to say, which was meant to be a kindness, and was instead the last unkind thing I ever said to her. I said, "I don't know who you've been talking to, but you can't know any of this. You run a kitchen." She looked up then. She had pale eyes, the color of weak tea, and they were not angry. That is what undid me in the end. There was never any anger in her. Not that night, not later, not at the worst of it. She looked at me the way a teacher looks at a boy who has gotten the easy question wrong, with a patience that had no bottom to it, and she said, "I ran a kitchen tonight, yes. I've run other things." And she turned the map so it faced me, and she put one flour-dusted finger on the cut under Saddle 3, and she said, "Sit down, Captain Vane, and I'll show you how to bring your 11 men home. And then you're going to go wake the colonel, because I'm going up that mountain whether he signs the order or not, and it will go better for everyone, including you, if it has a signature on it." I sat down. I want the men I teach to understand that this is the whole story, really, compressed into one motion. A captain, certain of the shape of the world, pulling out a steel stool in a galley at 2 in the morning, and sitting down across from a woman in an apron because some animal part of him had finally registered that he was in the presence of something he did not have the tools to measure. I sat down. And she began to talk, low and even, and within 10 minutes the back of my neck was cold, because she was not guessing. Everything she said locked into everything else. She had a way of laying a plan down a piece at a time, each piece useless seeming alone and then suddenly load-bearing. And I realized I was watching a mind that built the way we were taught the very best minds built, from the objective backward, never falling in love with a method, discarding 3 good ideas to keep the one that survived contact. By 2:30 I had stopped thinking she can't know this and started, with a kind of vertigo, thinking who is she? By 300 I had stopped asking that too, because the question had answered itself in the only way that mattered. She was the person who was going to do this, and I was the person who was finally, 2 days too late, going to help. Waking Rain was its own small war. I will spare you most of it. He came into the galley in a watch cap with his eyes swollen from the kind of sleep that isn't rest, and he stood over the penciled map with his jaw working. And twice he opened his mouth to say something that would have been about the apron, and twice he didn't, because the map was the map, and a man who has spent 40 years reading ground cannot unsee a good plan just because the wrong hands drew it. He asked her 3 questions. They were sharp, they were the right questions, the questions of a man trying to find the lie. Where is the watch schedule from? How do you cross the second choke point without being heard? What happens when one of the captives can't walk? She answered all 3 without hurry. The watch schedule was from 4 nights of her own observation, she said, from a hide on the false crest 2 ridges out, which meant she had been gone from the firebase on 4 nights that none of us had noticed, which told me how much she had let us not notice. The second choke point she did not cross. She went under it, through a terrace drain she'd found on her belly in the dead time. And when he asked what happens when a captive can't walk, she looked at him for a moment and said, "Then I carry him, Colonel, the way you'd carry one of yours." And something went across Rain's face that I had never seen on it before, and have rarely seen on any man since, which was the look of a person discovering that the thing he had shooed out of the room 2 days ago might be the best soldier on his firebase. He signed nothing. There was nothing to sign. What she was proposing existed in no doctrine and on no form. What he did instead was harder for a man like him. He stood up straight in the galley at 3 in the morning and he said, "What do you need?" Not "here's what I'll allow asterisk." What do you need? She needed almost nothing. That was the next thing that frightened me. A great rescue, I had assumed, required a great apparatus. The gunships, the assault element, the medics staged forward, the weight of the machine. She wanted a radio, a specific one, an old manpack she named by its nomenclature, because it was heavy and ugly and would take a battery she could scavenge and would reach us from inside the cut when nothing newer would. She wanted 3 days of food that weighed almost nothing. She wanted us to do exactly one thing on a schedule she would dictate, which was to make noise, to run a loud, clumsy, obvious feint at the southern choke point at specific hours on specific nights, to pull the watch's attention south while she worked the northwest face, and she made me repeat the hours back to her twice, and she said, "If you're early, men die. If you're late, men die. Be exactly on time, Captain. That's the whole job I'm giving you. Can you do the whole job?" And I said yes. And I meant it the way I had never meant a yes in my life. She left at the next dark, on foot, alone, out the back of the wire where the ground broke up. And the last I saw of her, she was a small shape with a too big radio on her back, going down into the scree without a sound. And then she was part of the mountain, and the mountain swallowed her. And I went back to the war room to begin the only job I had been given, which was to be exactly on time. I am going to tell you what happened up there as I came to know it, which was in pieces. Some of it over the radio and her flat 90-second transmissions, most of it afterward from the men she brought back. A little of it from a sealed record I was not supposed to read and read anyway, years later, standing up, because I could not bear to be sitting down for it. I am going to tell it as straight as I can because the temptation with a story like this is to make it a miracle, and it was the opposite of a miracle. A miracle is a thing that happens to you. What she did on purpose, one deliberate piece at a time, and the deliberateness is the whole point. There was no luck in it that she had not first earned the right to spend. The 40 miles took her a night and a day. She moved at night and lay up at first light in a hide she'd already chosen on her 4 reconnaissance trips, which is a thing only a certain kind of operator does the dangerous, boring work of finding your shelters before you need them, so that when you need them you are not searching, you are arriving. She crossed the first choke point in the dead time she'd circled in pencil, the 20-minute changeover, and she did not hurry through it, because hurrying is how you make sound. She flowed through it slow in the seam, and was gone before the relief sentry's eyes had adjusted to the dark. The second choke point she went under, through the old terrace drain, and she lay in 8 inches of cold runoff for 40 minutes while a patrol smoked and talked above her head. and she did not move. And the part of the after-action that still stops my breath is the detail, from her own later debrief, given flat, that she used the 40 minutes to massage warmth back into her hands one finger at a time so that, when she came out of the drain, her hands would work. Because cold hands kill you in the cut, and a person who plans does not arrive at the decisive moment with hands she has not prepared. She reached the terrace works under Saddle 3 on the second night, and she did not go in. This is the thing that the young men I teach find hardest to believe, and it is the heart of her, so I make them sit with it. She had crossed 40 miles of enemy ground to reach 11 of our men being held by people who would put them on camera in 2 days, and she got there, and she stopped, and she watched for a full night and a full day before she did anything at all. She lay on the false crest above the cut in the cold without a fire, eating almost nothing, and she counted. She counted the guards. She timed their rotation, confirmed the schedule she'd built from 2 ridges out, found the one place it was wrong and corrected it. She marked which of the 11 could walk and which could not. She could see them, in a pit cut into the terrace, and she watched long enough to know that 2 were badly hurt and 1 was barely conscious, and she folded that knowledge into the plan, because a plan that does not account for the men who cannot walk is a plan that gets those men killed. She found the generator that ran the lights, and she found the fuel for it, and she found the single sentry who got sleepy at the far end of the 3rd watch every night, the same man, the same hour, leaning on the same post, and she made him part of the plan too. A whole day. The clock she herself had named was eating into its last hours, and she spent a day lying still in the cold doing nothing but learning, because she understood the thing the rest of us never quite learn, which is that the patience is not the part before the work. The patience is the work. The 20 seconds of violence at the end are just the bill coming due on the patience. I have tried in the years since to make the young officers feel the weight of that still day, because it is the part their bodies rebel against. They can imagine the carry. The carry is heroic. The carry moves. They cannot imagine lying motionless in the freezing dark for 18 hours within sight of men you have come to save, not warming yourself, not eating more than a mouthful, not closing your eyes for longer than the discipline allows, while the clock you yourself set runs toward the morning they go on camera. Every instinct in a good soldier screams to move, to act, to close the distance, to do the thing. She did not move. She had learned, somewhere in all those black-barred years, that the urge to act is the most dangerous thing a rescuer carries, more dangerous than the cold or the enemy, because it is the urge that gets people killed an hour early. So she lay still and let the urge burn itself out and kept counting, and when she finally did move, on the 3rd night, every motion she made was a motion she had already rehearsed in her mind 100 times against the real geometry of the real ground, so that what looked, to the men in the pit, like a single fluid impossible act of rescue, was in truth the careful execution of a thing she had built and tested and timed across a day and a night of doing, to all appearances, nothing at all. The stillness was not the absence of the work. The stillness was the work, done where no one could see it, which is where she did all her best work, which is the whole of what she was. On the 3rd night she went in. I had her faint running on the southern choke point at the hours she'd set. We made a glorious racket, vehicles, a few illumination rounds, a deliberately sloppy probe by a squad I'd briefed to be loud and to break contact and live, and it worked. It pulled the watch south. I could hear on the intercepts the chatter shifting that way. Men called from their posts to reinforce a threat that was not the threat. And on the blind northwest face, in the 20-minute seam between watches that she had found by lying in the cold for 4 weeks before any of us knew a team would even be lost, she came down into the cut. What she did inside the cut she did mostly without firing a shot, and I want to be careful here, because the men I teach always want this part to be loud, and it was the opposite of loud. It was quieter than the patience that came before it. She took the sleepy sentry at the far post first, not killed him. Took him. A hand and a hold and a weight of body learned somewhere none of us had a clearance high enough to ask about, and he went down without a sound and stayed down. She took the generator next, not by blowing it but by reaching into it. Because a generator that is sabotaged loudly brings men running, and a generator that simply dies brings one annoyed mechanic. And she had counted on the annoyed mechanic, and she was waiting for him, and she took him too. The lights went out across the terrace works, and in the dark and the confusion of a southern feint pulling everyone the wrong way, 11 men in a pit looked up and saw a small figure at the lip of it with a finger to her lips. I have heard the next part from 4 of those men, and they each tell it a little differently, but they all tell the one thing the same. She did not announce herself. She did not say a unit, a name, a call sign, a reassurance. She came down into the pit and she went straight to the man who was barely conscious, Sergeant First Class Daniel Pell, who would have been dead in another day, and she got a hand under his jaw and checked him the way a medic checks a man, fast and sure, and then she began in a whisper to give orders. Quiet, flat, total orders. Who would carry whom? Who would move when? What the sound discipline would be. And 11 of the best soldiers in that theater, men who outranked her for all they knew, men who had been broken down by days in that pit, took her orders without a word of question, because there is a thing that comes off a person who actually knows what they are doing that the body recognizes before the mind can argue, and every one of them recognized it. The 2 who could walk took the 2 who could half walk. She took Pell herself across her back, the way she had told Rain she would, the way you'd carry one of yours. And then she walked them out the way she had come in, through the seam in the dark, with the feint still hammering away to the south, 11 men and herself, up out of the cut and onto the false crest and into the cold high country, and she did not run, because running makes sound and breaks formation and loses the man at the back, and she had spent 40 miles in 4 nights and a whole still day buying the right to not have to run. The first transmission I got from her came at 3:40. 90 seconds flat, no triumph in it. 11 recovered, 1 critical holding, moving, keep your feint till 4, then go dark and don't come looking, you'll only draw the sweep onto us. Be at the foot of the goat track under Ash Hollow at first light day after tomorrow with litters and a surgeon. Out. That was all. No, we did it asterisk. No, tell the colonel asterisk. A status, a schedule and an instruction, and then the radio went quiet, and I sat in the war room with my hand over my mouth, and across the table Colonel Rain, who had not slept in 3 days, put both fists flat on the map and bowed his head, and a major I had seen carry himself like a granite block began, silently, to weep. The way out was harder than the way in, because now there were 12 and one of them was dying. The enemy figured out by the second hour that the pit was empty, and the feint that had pulled them south now pulled them back north in a fury, and the hunt that came up the mountain behind her was the thing I had been most afraid of from the first night, the bracket, the thing I had told Rain would kill any column we sent. It would have killed a column. It did not kill her, because she was not a column. She was one mind moving 12 bodies, and a single mind in good country can do what a column cannot, which is disappear. She broke them into the terrain. She used the deadfall scree that funneled everyone else into the choke points to do the opposite for her, sliding her party along the broken seams where the pursuit's own size worked against it. She put her people in a dry watercourse and lay them down and walked, alone, a quarter-mile off to the east, and deliberately disturbed a scree slope so that the hunt followed the sign she left and not the men she'd hidden, and then she came back for them in the dark by a route she'd already memorized, and moved them again. Every mile of progress cost her 3 of effort, scout ahead, return, carry Pell forward, go back for the next, all of it on a body that had not truly slept in days and was burning through a fuel reserve that food that weighs almost nothing cannot replace. She gave Pell her water. The men told me that. She gave the dying sergeant her water and took, for herself, the discipline of going without. And when one of the walking wounded started to fail in the cold, she talked him through it the whole night, low, an unbroken litany of small next things. 1 more step to that rock, now 1 more to that one. You are not climbing a mountain. You are taking the next step, That's all there has ever been, and she kept him alive on her voice the way you keep a fire alive with your breath. The second night was the one that nearly took them, and not from the enemy. It was the cold, and it was a corporal named Briggs, one of the walking wounded, who simply stopped. He sat down on a rock in the black and would not get up. The men told me about it afterward with a kind of hush, because they had all felt the thing he felt, the great seductive weight of just being done, and they had all been a half step from sitting down beside him. He was not refusing out of weakness exactly. He was refusing out of arithmetic, the deadly arithmetic that the cold and the exhaustion do for you, that says you are slowing the others, that says you will not make it anyway, that says the kindest thing you can do is stop being a load. She did not argue with the arithmetic. The men said that was the strange part. She did not tell him he was wrong, did not bully him, did not invoke his pride or his unit or his mother. She crouched down in front of him in the dark, and she put her face close to his, and she gave him a smaller arithmetic to replace the big one. Not the mountain, not home, just the next rock. You're not getting off this ridge, she told him, flat, almost gentle. I'm not asking you to, I'm asking you to get to that rock. The pale one, can you see it, just that one? Nothing past it exists. Get to the pale rock. And he got to the pale rock. And then there was another rock, and she named it. And he got to that one. And for the rest of the night she walked beside him between her trips back for Pell, feeding him the mountain one rock at a time, never once letting him see the whole of it, because the whole of it was the thing that had nearly killed him, and she had understood that the way she understood everything, completely and without drama. She kept a dying sergeant alive on her back and a quitting corporal alive on her voice across the same black hours, and she did the two jobs at once, scouting and carrying and nomming rocks, every mile costing her 3. And when I add up, even now, the sheer arithmetic of effort she spent that one night, the math she did with her own body, I cannot make it balance. It does not balance. She spent more than a person has. That is simply what the record shows, and I have stopped trying to explain it and started just telling it. Because some things the arithmetic says no to, and a person does anyway. Because the other answer is a thing they cannot live with. For a day and a night the bracket nearly closed. There was one stretch, I learned later, where an enemy element passed within 40 meters of where she had her people stilled in a fold of ground, and she lay across Pell with her hand over his mouth to feel his breathing and keep it quiet, and they did not move for 2 hours, and not one of those broken, exhausted men made a sound, because she had told them not to, and they believed her more than they believed their own fear. That is a kind of authority I have spent the rest of my career trying to understand and have never matched. It does not come from rank. It does not come from volume. It comes from a person having so completely mastered the moment that everyone near them borrows the mastery and is steadied by it. She steadied 11 men through 40 miles of a closing hunt, and she did it without ever once raising her voice, and the only time any of them heard anything in her that sounded like effort was on the last ridge, at the very end, when the firebase came into view in the gray before dawn, and Pell, against every expectation, was still breathing on her back, and one of the men heard her let out a single long breath, and that was all. One breath. Then she got them up and moved them down the goat track into the light. I was at the foot of the goat track at first light, exactly on time, because being exactly on time was the whole job she had given me, and I had discovered in the carrying out of it that it was not a small job at all. We had the litters. We had the surgeon, a captain named Oyalaran who had been pulled out of his rack and briefed in a corridor, and who stood now in the cold stamping his feet, not yet believing what he had been told he was about to receive. We had a security element spread along the lower ground, and we had Colonel Rain, who had been ordered by no one to be there, and who I think could not have been kept away by a wall, standing a little apart with his hands behind his back, and his face set in the rigid stillness of a man holding himself together by main force. They came down out of the gray in a line. I had imagined in the back room of my head a ragged stumble, men at the end of everything. And the men were at the end of everything. You could see it in them, the gauntness, the 1,000-yard fixity, the way the walking wounded leaned. But they did not come down ragged. They came down in order, in a column, sound discipline still on them even in sight of home, each man's hand on the man ahead, and at the front of the column, small under the weight of a man across her back, came the woman from the galley, and she was not stumbling either. She was walking, measured even 1 foot and then the other, the exact same pace she must have held for 40 miles, and I understood, watching her, that the pace was not what was left of her strength. The pace was a decision. She had decided, somewhere up there, that she would walk these men home and not be carried through any gate, and she was keeping the decision with the last of herself the way she kept everything, completely. Oyalaran reached her first and went for Pell, and there was a moment, I saw it, where she would not let go, not from confusion. She held Pell's weight 1 beat longer than she needed to, and she said something to the surgeon, fast and low, and Oyalaran's whole posture changed, and he stopped reaching and started listening, because what she was giving him was a handoff, a clean clinical handoff, closed head injury query, hypothermia, fluids down, last lucid at such an hour, watch the left pupil, the kind of handoff one professional gives another, and only when she had given all of it, only when she was certain the man on her back had been fully transferred and not merely taken, did she let Pell go onto the litter. Then she straightened up. She had carried a grown man 40 miles, and she straightened up without a hand on her knee, and she looked around at the firebase in the growing light, at the litters filling with her recovered men, at the surgeon already working, at the security element, at me, at Colonel Rain standing rigid and silver and undone 20 feet away, and she did the most ordinary thing in the world. She wiped her hands on her thighs, the way a person does coming in from work, and she started toward the galley. She was going to make breakfast. I understood it with a lurch. 240 people were going to want feeding in an hour, and she was the person who fed them, and she had a job, and she was going to go do it. Because in her mind nothing that had happened on that mountain changed the fact that the firebase ran on hot food, and she ran the hot food. She got perhaps 10 steps toward the galley before Rain's voice stopped her. It was not loud. It cracked on the first word, and he let it crack, which from that man was an act of nakedness I would not have believed him capable of. "Sergeant," he said it like a question. He did not know her rank, none of us did, that was the whole of it, that was the indictment of us all, and he reached for the only word a man like him had, the word that meant soldier, that meant one of mine, and he put it onto her like a question and a plea. She stopped. She turned. And Colonel Aldous Rain, 60 years old, 40 years in, every ribbon earned in blood, took 2 steps toward her across the cold ground and stopped at a correct distance and came to attention and brought his hand up in a salute that was not the casual brush of daily courtesy, but the full thing, the slow, deliberate thing you give to the colors and the fallen, and he held it. She let him hold it for a moment. And then, this is the part the men I teach need most, so I always slow down here. She did not soften it, and she did not perform it back. She came to attention herself, in the apron, in the filth of 40 miles, and she returned the salute exactly cleanly, and she held her hand up after his had come down, a half-second longer, the way the senior person does, the small, unmistakable courtesy of rank that told every soldier watching, before any file was opened, before any name was known, precisely who in that yard was senior to whom. Then she dropped her hand last, and she said, "Thank you, Colonel," and there was nothing in it but a steady kindness, no triumph, no rebuke, and she turned and went and made breakfast, and the firebase stood in the cold and watched her go, and not one man moved until the galley door had shut behind her. The file came up from the rear 2 days later, and I was the one who carried it into the war room, and I have thought a great deal, in the years since, about the fact that it took a sealed file to make us believe what our own eyes had already shown us. That is the failure underneath the failure. We had watched her bring 11 men down off an impossible mountain. We had watched the surgeon save Pell's life on a handoff she'd given. We had watched the colonel salute her in the dirt. And still, some animal stubbornness in us, in me, needed the paper, needed the official seal, needed the institution to say yes, her, believe it before we would let ourselves fully know the thing we knew. I am not proud of that, but I will not hide it because the men I teach have the same stubbornness in them, and the only cure for it is to see it named in someone else first. I will not tell you everything that was in the file. Most of it I am still not cleared to say, and the rest is hers, and a person's record is not mine to spend for the sake of a good story. But I can tell you the shape of it, because the shape is what the war room saw, and the shape is the whole of it. The bulk of the pages were black. Redacted, bar after bar after bar, line after line struck out, whole missions reduced to a date, a duration, and a censor's ink, and that the men who have lived in this world will understand that is the tell. You do not black out a quartermaster's record. You do not redact the woman who runs the galley. The black bars were the loudest thing in the file. They said, in the only language the institution has for it, what this person did, you are not permitted to know, and the reason you are not permitted to know is that it mattered too much. And in among the black bars, unredacted, left visible the way you leave the one thing that is meant to be read, was a designation, a specialty. A community of operators whose existence we acknowledge the way you acknowledge weather in the abstract, never expecting to stand next to it. The people the institution sends, alone, to bring its people back from places it cannot officially go. Personnel recovery. The ones whose entire profession is the 40-mile walk and the patient day in the cold and the carry. And a call sign, typed clean in the middle of all that black, the name the men she had pulled out of other pits in other years had given her, because she came when no one else could and she took nothing for it and she left them standing. Cinder. The thing that is left when the fire has done its work, that holds its heat long after the flame is gone, that you can still warm your hands at in the dark. I read it standing in the war room with the staff around me, and the room went very quiet, and I watched the same understanding move across face after face, the same 2-day late dawn. Holt, who had said the nerve of some people, sat down slowly in a folding chair as though his legs had stopped agreeing to the job. Rain did not sit. Rain stood at the head of the table where he had stood when he told her to stay in the kitchen in the exact spot, and he read the file through once without a word, and then he read it again, and when he set it down his hands were not entirely steady, and he said to no one, to all of us, to himself most of all, she told us where they were. The first night. She told us everything and I sent her back to the kitchen. And there was no excusing it, and he did not try to. And the not trying was the most soldierly thing I ever saw him do. He had her brought to the war room that evening. Not summoned, brought by request, with a courtesy that had not been in the building 2 days before. She came in the apron. I think now that she wore the apron on purpose, that last time, not out of humility and not out of pride, but out of something cleaner than either. A refusal to be a different person now that we knew, as if to say I was always this. The apron changed nothing. Your eyes changed, not me. She set no tray down. She stood at the foot of the map table, the same place she had stood when she told us we were planning the wrong thing, and she folded her hands in front of her apron, and she waited. And Colonel Rain brought the war room to its feet. He did not order it. That is what I want the men I teach to hold on to, because they always assume when I get here that someone called the room to attention. No one called it. Rain simply stood. He was already standing, but he straightened. He came to the full attention of a man half his years, and he saluted her. And then Holt rose from his folding chair and saluted. And then the staff, one by one, not on a command but the way water finds its level. Every officer in that low plywood room with the bare bulbs and the single screen came to his feet and brought his hand up. And I rose with them, and I put my hand up and I held it. And I found that my throat had closed and my eyes were not dry, and I did not care. Because I was 20 feet from the woman I had steered out a door with a hand that did not quite touch her shoulder. The woman I had told to stick to the coffee. And there was no apology in any language equal to the size of it. And the salute was the only apology we had. And we gave it to her, all of us. The whole war room standing and silent with our hands up. She let us hold it. She looked at us, at the room full of men who had needed a file to believe their own eyes, and there was no cruelty in her face and no triumph, and I want to be exact about this, no false grace either. She did not wave it off. She did not say, "Oh, stop, it was nothing," because it was not nothing, and she would not insult our shame by pretending it was. She received it. She let the room give her the thing it owed her, fully, without rushing it, because she understood that we needed to give it more than she needed to receive it, that the salute was for us, that a man cannot carry that kind of wrongness around inside him and stay whole, and that she was, even now, even here, doing the thing she always did, which was bringing men back from a place they could not get out of alone. And then she came to attention, and she returned it, one clean motion to the whole room at once, and she held her hand up a half-second past all of ours, last, senior, and she dropped it, and the room came down with her. I went to the galley that night after. I do not fully know what I went there to do. Apologize, I told myself, though I had enough sense by then to know that an apology offered to make the apologizer feel better is just one more thing taken from the person owed it. She was at the steel prep table again, the day's work not letting go of her again, and this time there was no map, only a mug of the coffee she made too strong, and a second mug already poured and set across from her, which stopped me in the doorway, because it meant she had known I was coming, or known someone was, and had set a place for him. "Sit, Captain Vane," she said. "You've been standing at attention long enough." I sat. I had a speech and I did not give it. What I said instead, after a while into the mug, was the only honest thing I had. I said, "I didn't see you. For 2 years I didn't see you. I'm the operations officer. Seeing is the whole job, and I didn't see you at all." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said a thing I have repeated to every class I have ever taught, every promotion board I have ever sat, every young officer who has ever come into my office certain of the shape of the world. She said, "You saw an apron and you stopped looking. That's not a failure of eyes, Captain. It's a failure of patience. You decided what I was so you wouldn't have to do the work of finding out." Most of the bad things men do to each other start exactly there, not with cruelty, with the decision to stop looking. She turned her mug a quarter turn on the steel, a small, precise motion, the same economy I'd watched her move with on the mountain. I've spent my life being the person no one looks at. It's the most useful thing about me. The man who has to tell you what he isn't it yet, he's still becoming it, still needs you to agree. The real thing doesn't need you to know. It just needs to get the work done. She looked up at me with those weak tea eyes. "I didn't go up that mountain to prove anything to your colonel. I went up because there were 11 men in a pit and I was the one who could get them out. That's all it ever is. The proving is something you all do afterward with your salutes and your files. The work doesn't care about any of it." We sat a while in the quiet of the galley, the ovens ticking as they cooled, the wind working at the shelter wall the way it always did up there, and I understood that she was giving me time, the way she'd given Briggs the pale rock and Pell her water, letting me arrive at a thing in my own time rather than dragging me to it. I had come in certain I owed her words, and was learning that what I owed her was attention, which is harder and quieter and worth more. I had spent 2 years not seeing her, and now I could not stop seeing her. The forearms, the steady hands, the economy of every motion. And I felt the particular grief of a man who realizes that the lesson was available to him every single day for 2 years, set down twice a day at his own elbow with the coffee, and that he had simply chosen, every one of those days, not to look. I asked her, I had to, why she had let me steer her out of the war room that first night, why she had let any of it land on her, the stay in the kitchen, the shoeing hand, the asterisk stick to the coffee asterisk, when she could have laid us all flat with a single line about who she was. And she gave me the second thing I have carried, and it is harder than the first, and I give it to the young ones knowing most of them are not ready for it. Because being right in front of a room, she said, is worth less than nothing if it costs you the time. I could have spent 10 minutes making your colonel feel small and earning my way back into that briefing. 10 minutes I didn't have. Those men didn't have. So I let him be wrong about me, and I went and got the map, and I started building the thing that would actually save them. Pride is the most expensive thing a person can carry into a fight, Captain. It weighs more than a radio and it saves no one. I set mine down a long time ago. She almost smiled then, the only time I ever saw it nearly happen. Besides, a person who has to be respected before she'll do the work isn't strong. She's just loud. Real strength is generous because it has enough to give away. I had 11 men's worth of strength that night and not 1 ounce of it to waste on your colonel's manners, so I gave him his rudeness for free and kept the rest for the mountain. I have thought about that for 15 years. Real strength is generous because it has enough to give away. I watched her give it away the whole time, I realized, once I had the eyes to look back. She gave Pell her water. She gave the failing man her voice all night. She gave the surgeon a clean handoff when she could barely stand. She gave Rain back his dignity in the war room by returning his salute instead of grinding his shame in deeper. And she gave me, in a galley at midnight, the truest lesson of my life across a mug of coffee, asking nothing for it. The generosity was not separate from the strength. The generosity was the proof of it. A weak person hoards. Only someone with enough to spare gives it away mid-fight. And she gave it away the entire way up that mountain and the entire way down. And that, more than the 40 miles or the 11 men or the day in the cold, is what told me what she actually was. Pell lived. I should tell you that plainly, because the men I teach always ask, and because it matters to the shape of what she was. Oyalaran worked on him through that first day and into the night, and the closed head injury that should have killed him on the mountain, that would have killed him. If a person carrying him 40 miles had not known to keep his airway clear and his head still, and had not given the surgeon the one detail about the left pupil that changed the whole order of treatment, that injury let go of him slowly over weeks. He woke on the 4th day. He did not remember the pit. He did not remember the cut or the carry or the closing bracket. The first thing he remembered, the men told me, the first clear image he had of being alive again, was a small figure at the lip of a pit with a finger to her lips, and a whisper, and a hand under his jaw that was sure. He asked, when he could ask, who she was. And the men who had been with him in that pit, the 10 who had walked out under her orders, told him the only thing any of us could tell anyone in those first days before the file came up, which was, we don't know. She runs the galley. And Pell, who had a hole in his memory where the worst days of his life should have been, said the thing that I think is the truest verdict anyone ever passed on her, truer than the file, truer than the salute. He said, no, she runs something. The galley's just where she keeps it. I talked to all 11 of them over the following weeks because I was the operations officer and the after-action was mine to write, and this time I was going to write it correctly, the whole of it with her in it, weather and all. And the thing that came back from every one of them in 11 different sets of words was the authority. Not the skill, though they spoke of the skill. The authority. These were not impressionable men. These were the best soldiers in the theater, hard, senior, not given to awe. And every one of them, describing the pit and the cut and the long broken march home, came to the same place, the moment she gave the first whispered order and the thing in them that stopped being afraid. I'd have followed her into the sea. One of them said to me, a master sergeant with 3 tours, a man who did not say things like that, and he looked embarrassed to have said it, and then he looked like he meant it more than he'd meant anything. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her rank. I'd have followed her into the sea. That is the thing I have never been able to manufacture in myself or teach to another man, the authority that asks for nothing and receives everything, and I have come to believe it cannot be manufactured at all, that it is simply what competence looks like when it has been stripped of every need to be seen. She needed no one to know what she was, and so everyone, in the moment that mattered, knew exactly what she was. The firebase was a different place after. I do not want to overstate it. Men are men, and the world does not remake itself in a week, but something had moved that did not move back. The galley line was different. There was a quality of attention in it that had not been there. Men who had walked past her for 2 years now meeting her eyes, 100 small daily salutes that no regulation required and that she received each time with the same level nod, no more for the general than for the youngest private, because she did not run a ledger of respect. She had never been keeping score. The score was a thing the rest of us discovered we'd been losing. Rain changed the most and changed quietest. He never spoke of that first night again, not to excuse it and not to flagellate himself over it in public, but I noticed, everyone noticed, that he had stopped deciding what people were by looking at them. He started asking. A new medic, a young supply clerk, a contractor fixing the pump. He asked them their names, asked what they'd done before, and he listened to the answers. And once I watched him stand in the galley doorway for a full minute just watching her work, an old silver colonel watching a woman make bread, with an expression on his face that I can only call studious, as though he were learning, very late, a thing he should have been taught at the beginning, and was determined to learn it now even if it had cost 11 men nearly everything for him to start. I asked her once, near the end of my time at Ash Hollow, whether it angered her, any of it. The years of being furniture, the stay in the kitchen, the file full of black bars that meant she could never be thanked in the open for the men she'd brought home out of the dark. She thought about it longer than I expected, turning her mug that quarter turn, and then she said, "Anger is just pride that's been stepped on. I told you, I set the pride down. There's nothing left for the anger to stand on." And then she said the last thing I'll give you of hers, the one I had carved, eventually, into the small plaque under the glass case where the apron hangs. The work was never about being seen. If they'd seen me, the work would have been harder. I'd have lost the one advantage I had. So I'll tell you what I tell the young ones I train, the ones in the world that isn't on any chart. Don't pray to be respected. Pray to be useful. Respect is a thing other people might give you or might not, and you can't carry it into a fight. But useful is a thing you can be all by yourself in the dark with no one watching when it counts the most. Be so useful that one day, when they finally look, they have no choice but to stand up. And then, and here she did almost smile, the second and last time, be gracious about it. Because you didn't do it for the standing up. You did it for the men in the pit. The standing up is just them catching up to what was already true. I want to go back, before I bring this home, to the 4 nights she spent on the False Crest weeks before any team was lost, because the men I teach always skip past it, and it is the part I most need them to understand. When the recon team went silent on that Wednesday, the rest of us reacted. We were caught flat-footed, scrambling, building plans from nothing in the panic of a clock running down. She did not react, because she had already, weeks before, done the boring, dangerous work that meant she did not have to. She had walked out of the wire on 4 separate nights that none of us logged and lain in a cold hide 2 ridges out from a holding ground that, at the time, held no one we cared about. And she had timed the watch and mapped the seams and found the terrace drain and noted the sleepy sentry on the 3rd rotation. And she had done it not because she knew a team would be taken, but because that is what her kind of professional does. They learn the ground before the ground matters, so that when it matters, they are not learning, they are remembering. The plan that saved 11 men was not built in the galley at 2 in the morning the night I found her. It was built over weeks of patient, unwitnessed, unthanked labor, and assembled in 10 minutes in front of me only because all the pieces were already cut and cured and waiting. We thought we'd watched a woman improvise a miracle. We'd watched a professional cash a check she had spent a long time depositing. That is the whole difference between luck and craft, and it is the thing I most distrust myself for having missed. A miracle is something that happens to you. What she did happened the other way around. She made it happen deliberately in advance in the cold, with no one watching, on the chance that one day it would be needed. There was no luck up there she had not first earned the right to spend. The blind seam between watches, she'd found it weeks before by lying still and counting. The drain under the 2nd choke point found, crawled, measured before it was ever needed. The generator and its fuel and the one mechanic who'd come to fix it counted, timed, folded into the plan. Even the carry, even Pell's airway, even the detail about the left pupil that let the surgeon save his life, none of it was improvisation. It was a lifetime of preparation arriving exactly where preparation is supposed to arrive, which is at the one moment that cannot be redone. We called it a miracle because miracle is the word lazy men use for craft they were too incurious to recognize while it was being built right in front of them, in a galley, by a woman in an apron, who they had decided was furniture. I left Ash Hollow 8 months later reassigned, and I never served with her again. I do not know to this day all of where she had been or all of what she had done, and I have made my peace with not knowing, because the not knowing is the point. It is the shape of her whole life, the usefulness so complete it required invisibility, the strength so secure it could afford to be unseen. I heard, years later third hand, through a man who knew a man, that Cinder had gone into another set of hills after another set of lost men, and had brought them out the same way, alone, on foot, asking nothing, and I believed it without needing the file, because by then I finally had the eyes to believe my own knowing. I do not know if she is still alive. The ones like her tend to go quiet at the end the way they lived, without a parade, and the institution that sends them into the dark is not in the habit of announcing when one of them does not come back. But I keep her apron in a glass case on my office wall, behind my commendations, where the morning light hits it first, and the young officers who come into my office to be certain about the shape of the world always notice it eventually and always ask, and that is when I tell them this. I tell them about the night I steered a woman out of a war room with a hand that did not quite touch her shoulder and told her to stick to the coffee, while she was telling me, correctly, exactly how to save 11 men. I tell them that I left her out of the after-action report the way you leave out the weather, and that the omission is the truest confession I have ever made. I tell them that a sealed file full of black bars finally made us believe what our own eyes had already proven, and that the needing of the file is the failure underneath the failure, the one they carry in themselves right now and do not yet know they carry. I tell them that the war room rose to her unordered, the way water finds its level, and that she returned the salute and dropped her hand last, senior, gracious, asking nothing. And then I tell them the only orders I have ever given that I am completely sure were right. Do not decide what a person is so that you can stop looking at them. The decision to stop looking is where nearly every wrong thing begins, and it does not feel like cruelty when you do it. It feels like efficiency. It feels like good judgment. It feels exactly the way good judgment feels, which is why it is so dangerous. Look longer than is comfortable. Look at the ones no one looks at. Ask the names. And when you find, as you will if you look long enough, more than once in a career, that the most capable person in the room has been standing quietly at the edge of it the entire time, useful and unthanked and asking for nothing, do not waste a single minute on the shame of having missed them. They will not want the shame. They will want, the way she wanted, only the work done and the men brought home. Give them that, and then stand up. Stand all the way up and hold the salute, and drop your hand last only if they are not senior to you, which, in every way that finally matters, they almost always are. She told me, in a galley at midnight, to pray to be useful rather than respected. I have prayed it every day since, and most days I fall short, and the falling short is all right, because the prayer is the point and the prayer is hers. There was a woman who fed 240 soldiers twice a day and walked, alone, into the dark to bring our lost men home, and asked for nothing, and got, in the end, the only thing the rest of us had to give, which was the late and inadequate and absolutely necessary sight of a whole war room on its feet. They told her to stay in the kitchen. She went up the mountain instead, and she came back down it with 11 men and a lesson, and she left the lesson with a captain who had been wrong in the worst possible way, so that he could spend the rest of his life trying to be a little less wrong, and teach others to be wrong a little less than that. That is what Cinder was. That is what the apron in the glass case means. And that is why, every morning I make sure the light hits it first.